Greetings from American Exception. I'm Aaron Good, and we are here with another installment in our Empire and the Deep State series on my book, American Exception. This series is a joint production of American Exception and the Geopolitical Economy Report. I am again joined by Ben Norton and series producer Seamus McGuinness. In today's episode, we look at JFK's relationship with Nasser of Egypt. Nasser will also be coming up in the next entry in this series, which focuses on JFK's Israel policies.
Hey everyone, how's it going? I'm Ben Norton, and I'm joined by my co-hosts Aaron Good and Seamus McGuinness of the American Exception podcast. This is the Empire and Deep State series that we're doing, which is a history of the U.S. Empire and U.S. Deep State. And this is based on Aaron's book, American Exception, Empire and the Deep State. Aaron is a political scientist and historian. And we're continuing our discussion of the history of the John F. Kennedy administration, JFK, leading up to his assassination. And in the previous part, we discussed Indonesia and the destabilization policy targeting the leftist nationalist leader Sukarno, and the so-called confrontasi, which was basically a kind of proxy war against Sukarno's Indonesia, backed by the US and Britain. And of course, Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim majority country. It's one of the most populous countries on earth. It's a very important country. It had the biggest communist party outside of the Soviet Union and China until the 1965 coup against Sukarno and the genocide of between 1 and 3 million leftists in Indonesia, which was backed by the CIA. Of course, JFK is killed before that coup in 65. And we talked about how JFK had planned on taking a trip to Indonesia, but he was not able to because he was assassinated. So Indonesia is an important part of the discussion, but we also said at the end of the last part that we're going to continue today discussing Egypt. Egypt had a leader who was in many ways similar to Sukarno in Indonesia. In Egypt, they had Nasser, who was a leftist, a nationalist. He was also with Sukarno, one of the co-founders of the non-aligned movement. So, Aaron, what was Kennedy's policy toward the rest of the Muslim majority world, especially, West Asia, the so-called Middle East, and North Africa, and countries like Egypt?
Well, JFK was a very popular president in the global south, or the third world, as Sukarno called it, owing in part to speeches that he gave as a senator in support of third world nationalism, which we've discussed on previous issues, especially his opposition to the Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles policies in French Algeria and Indochina, where the U.S. was supporting French colonialism, and elements of the U.S., especially the U.S. establishment, were behind de Gaulle's efforts to hold on to this empire, although it's eventually de Gaulle who moves to dismantle the empire. And but the JFK, because he was against French colonialism and was more so than the president and was publicly speaking against it, he was popular in the third world. In the 1960 campaign for president, JFK had made a lot of comments about foreign policy and about the Middle East. He said, if we can learn from the lessons of the past, if we can refrain from pressing our case so hard that the Arabs feel their neutrality and nationalism are threatened, the Middle East can become an area of strength and hope. So he's already making statements. I mean, rhetoric is rhetoric, of course, but he's already making statements more about respecting neutrality and nationalism in the among third world countries, among countries in the Arab world in particular. He's talking about here in the Middle East. And this is notable. It's a departure from what came before and after him. Now, it's not all. I mean, Kennedy had, as president, he looked to review what the Eisenhower policies were in the region. For example, it was the previous administration, the Eisenhower administration, that had installed the Shah in Iran through a CIA coup. And they'd removed Mossadegh. And Mossadegh was essentially exactly the kind of leader that Kennedy would have wanted to support. He was a democratically elected, committed to democracy, but also to the development of Iran. So he was interested in using Iran's resources to help Iran. This upset British Petroleum, which is the British state-owned oil company, and the Seven Sisters oil monopoly, of which British Petroleum is a part, did not like this either. They lobby the CIA, and eventually you have, as soon as Eisenhower gets elected, the overthrow of Mossadegh and the installation of the Shah as a U.S. client. Well, Kennedy actually, this is written about in James Bill's book. I think it's called The Eagle and the Lion, or the other way around, maybe The Lion and the Eagle. Either way, historian James Bill writes about how Kennedy actually really disliked the Shah, and he looked to see if it were possible to put Mossadeghists back in power, if there was some way to like change the government over there so that you would have a more democratic system and some of these Mossadeghists would actually be put back in charge. So he was looking to reverse, if it was possible, what Eisenhower had done, which is, I think, interesting. He also did not like the Saudis and the Saudi royal family. He thought they were backward and medieval. But they were so important to the U.S. that they were not disposable exactly, but he did not appreciate them. Now, I will say there's some, as with U.S. foreign policy, there are many mysteries that remain, and Kennedy is no exception, of course. There's a lot of mysteries around Kennedy and his death, as we know. There's the assassination under Kennedy's presidency of Qasim, or Qasim. I'm not sure how you pronounce the guy's name, but he was assassinated in 1963 in Iraq, and he was perhaps viewed as a potential Nasser-like character, but also described as kind of mercurial and unpredictable. But of course, every independent-minded leader is kind of described that way, so it's hard for me to have a good, solid understanding of what exactly he represented. But I know that Eisenhower, I've read that he did authorize his assassination in the late 50s, or at least the CIA tried to assassinate him in the late 50s. This has been written about and they failed, but in 1963, he does die. And it is, questionable as to whether or not Kennedy had anything to do with this. There was a lot of pressure, and he did have policies in that area that were looking into, influencing or manipulating or even undermining that government. But, did Kennedy authorize the assassination? There's no evidence that he did, no documentary evidence that he did, but you can never disprove those kind of things. It's a negative that can't be proven, as with the Castro assassinations. I will say that in April of 1961, de Gaulle he had survived some assassination attempts and coup attempts and so on. And he asked JFK about them. And JFK said that he didn't authorize de Gaulle's assassination, but he really couldn't control the CIA. So what you could say about the Iraq situation in 1963, I don't know. But today I'm going to talk mostly about Nasser here before we get into Israel. And Nasser was hated by various factions of the U.S. deep state, the U.S. establishment, the big supranational empire that the U.S. was setting up. So the British, the Seven Sisters oil cartel, the Israelis, the Saudis, of course, the French joined in that coalition, and that led to the Suez Crisis in 1956. So there were many elements that did not like Nasser and his pan-Arabism, which was Nasser's plan to create one big Arab state, to unify the Arab world so they wouldn't be weak and wouldn't be dominated by outside powers. That was Nasser's plan, which, of course, if you're an outside power that wants to dominate the Middle East, you may not like Nasser. I have a bunch of Time magazine covers here because this is, I feel like these are quite instructive because they're run by the Council on Foreign Relations pitchman for the American Century, Henry Luce. And a lot of the times they're just a good way to look at the propaganda that the U.S. is putting out. So these Nasser covers, you notice every one of them has a ancient Egypt motif with something a little weird also. Well, the first one's pretty straightforward. It's just him standing in front of some what looks like the drawings on the inside of a pyramid. The next one, though, they take it up a notch, and some of these ancient Egyptians are carrying, there's a Molotov cocktail and a rifle with a bayonet. So this is, I think, to sort of bring to mind that these are people in a ancient part of the world, pre-modern, not really part of Western civilization. I think this is a way to emphasize this. And if it was too subtle, they just add in some violence and weapons in there. And then the one on the right is even the weirdest because it's the Sphinx. And there seemed to be some sort of racial thing going on there with the profiles that is kind of deniable, but weird. They hired the best PR flacks and people to, descendants of Edward Bernays and so on. So is it like, Nasser is some sort of megalomaniac, of this giant monument to power that you see in the Middle East, the pyramids and so on? It's strange, especially when you know that Henry Luce would have been somebody who did not like Nasser. So the U.S. establishment does not like Nasser, but Kennedy himself was someone who thought he could work with Nasser. But there were lots of problems with this. In 1961, by 1961, you have this United Arab Republic, which really becomes for a time the United Arab States when Yemen joins. And this was something that people forget about, that for a time they were united as a nation state. The plan was, and they were formally organized this way. Egypt, Syria, and part of Yemen were part of this United Arab Republic, and then they become the United Arab States when Yemen joins. And this would have been, of course, very alarming to the U.S. establishment. In September of 61, though, this is broken up. This union with Syria is broken up by the military. And Nasser believes that this is a coup for good reason. He believes that it was a CIA-related operation for good reason, because back in 1949, you have what may have been the first CIA overthrow. We say, and I typically say, this is sort of common knowledge, that Iran 1953 was the first CIA coup, but really in 1949 there was a coup, and it seems that the CIA was involved. Charlotte Dennett, whose father was working over in the region at this time and had just been killed a couple years earlier, right? Dealing with these particular areas and issues, she believes that this was a CIA coup, and she went to Washington and had her father honored by Gina Haspel for being like essentially the first CIA fallen star or whatever they call it, even though it was really the CIG because it was right before the CIA got created formally. But she believes that this was a CIA coup, and it was written about. Essentially, there's a coup led by the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Hosni al-Zaim, and according to Douglas Little, who's a history professor at Clark University, this is one of the first covert actions that the CIA pulled off. There was a Time magazine article about this in 2017 titled "U.S. Intervened in Syria in 1949. Here's what happened." So they intervene, and this guy is eliminated, the Syrian president Shukri el-Kawatli. Now, it seems to be that this is really the reason why. So if you can read this on March, this is from Wikipedia. So this is this is essentially right from the CIA, more or less. On March 30th, 1949. So this is like what's not deniable. This is like, I think, key here. March 30th, 1949, al-Zaim seized power in a bloodless coup d'etat. There are highly controversial allegations that the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency engineered the coup. Most of the evidence currently available suggests that the decision to initiate a coup was Zaim's alone, but Zaim benefited from some degree of American assistance in planning the operation. This part is the key. 4 days after the coup that overthrew democratic rule, the Syrian government ratified the controversial Trans-Arabian pipeline deal. And there you see this. So this was the huge deal with, oil from the Middle East, Iraq, and from Iraq, Saudi Arabia, places where they still get oil today. The TAP line, that was a huge part of U.S. foreign policy. And so he's removed, and then a few days later, they ratify this very controversial pipeline deal. So
yeah, I mean, it's like the Nord Stream pipeline is being blown up. A few hours later, they opened the Baltic Sea pipeline between Poland and Norway. And obviously, I mean, just a coincidence. Nothing to see there. No one was involved. It was an accident. It was pro-Ukrainian groups
Well, they only say that afterwards. They only say that afterwards.
It was a Ukrainian oligarch who left his passport in the ocean, in the sea, after blowing up the pipelines.
Yeah, those passports will survive anything. But if we get back to the 1961 coup, so this is why Nasser has plenty of reason to be suspicious of the CIA in being involved in Syria, because they basically effected a coup in 1949. Even Wikipedia more or less hints at it very strongly and denies it. But of course, we know how seriously to take that. The U.S. ambassador tried to assure Nasser that the U.S. was not involved in this 1961 coup, and JFK actually tries to help. He refuses to recognize the new government in Syria until Nasser was ready for this to happen. And secondly, he requested more aid and a large loan to Egypt to cushion the impact of the split. So this could be read any number of ways, but at least it shows that JFK was conciliatory towards Nasser at this time.
So how did that relatively constructive relationship between JFK and Nasser start to break down as a result of the 1962 conflict that broke out in Yemen?
Well, in 1962, you had the royals who were running the country overthrown by a Republican, nationalist force. And this happens in 1962. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia supported the royals in this, as you might guess, one royal family supporting another. But Nasser supported the secular Republican nationalist forces and sent in ground troops. Whereas the royalists were backed by Jordan, England, and Israel. Kennedy, though, defying a specific request from Britain, he declared support for Nasser and for turning Yemen into a republic. So this is another example of Kennedy forsaking, to some degree, a European ally to forge a bond with a third world leader. He had done similar things, or third world nationalist movement. He'd done similar things in Algeria, with Indochina, Indonesia, Congo. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia and its Western friends, of whom there were many in high places, they wanted to drive a wedge between Kennedy and Nasser, who they really hated. They had no intention of seeking a truce or a peace settlement in this. The British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, and Golda Meir, who was the foreign minister of Israel at the time, tried to get Kennedy to withdraw support for Nasser in Yemen. JFK sends Ellsworth Bunker, who we've already talked about as negotiating, the return or the handover of New Guinea to Western New Guinea to Indonesia. Ellsworth Bunker is sent. He's an establishment guy, but someone that Kennedy trusts to work on these areas. He sent him to start these negotiations. Bunker had a letter from JFK for Nasser, reminding Nasser that Kennedy had withstood much to back him, and a whole lot was now on the line. Kennedy was frustrated, I think, by the failure to arrive at a truce through Bunker, because Bunker isn't able to be successful, or through the UN. So in this conflict, JFK, under pressure from Israel, Britain, Saudi Arabia, Seven Sisters, the Rockefeller orbit, he basically caves on this. And he tells his guy, Robert Comer of the NSC, the National Security Council, the guy in charge of the Middle East on the National Security Council, a Kennedy guy. He said it was because of the big oil investments we had there. So there was this fear that Yemen could spark a kind of Nasserist revolt against the Saudi monarchy, and that this would threaten Aramco's control of the big Dhahran oil field. And so Kennedy did not stick with Nasser. Nasser, through this, did not support the Republican forces in Yemen. This was, I think, a political calculation, like every choice presidents have to make. And so while he supported Nasser, he ultimately would not go against all these other forces. So additionally, he sends, to prevent any uprising like this from taking place in Saudi Arabia, the U.S. in April of 1963, sends 8 big fighter bombers and a certain number of military advisors that are unknown to train Saudi officers in aerial combat and counterinsurgency and such. So Kennedy was going to defend, as president, was going to defend Saudi Arabia. which is, you know, not so great in retrospect when you look at what Saudi Arabia is. However, this was the biggest material prize in human history, or one of them at the very least, if not the biggest. I mean, Indonesia, which is also up for grabs at this time, is really something. But this was a huge treasure that the U.S. had acquired really under Roosevelt. And it's, when you consider the timing and the situation that Kennedy was dealing with, it's not surprising that he would back down on this issue.
And what happened after that? Did Kennedy give up on trying to work with Nasser in any way? Did he turn against him? What was Kennedy's policy?
No, he didn't. I believe he still thought that he could work with Nasser, and as with Kennedy, he was playing with other places. He was playing a longer game that would have stretched into his second term. So I think that he had very different plans, very, very different plans from what happens to LBJ, as we'll get into. But at a May 8th, 1963 conference, Kennedy spoke of his commitment to progress in the region. Okay, easy enough to say. He also reiterated his support for the Arabs' aspirations for unity in that region. So he wasn't denouncing pan-Arabism. If anything, he understood it and, you know, gave statements of support for it. He also wrote a letter to Nasser acknowledging Egypt and Israel problems. He added that this would not stop him from pursuing a relationship with Egypt. He also wrote that he would not oppose Nasser's attempt to form a pan-Arab union. And he closed by saying Nasser could be reassured against any Israeli expansionism in the region.
So was Nasser buying the rhetoric from Kennedy, or how did the Kennedy administration's policies here sort of impact the longer term relations with Nasser's Egypt?
Well, this will bleed into other questions that we're going to get into when we talk about Israel, because Israel's policies really impacted Nasser a lot, and Israel is obsessed with Nasser. In some, JFK's other policies toward Nasser and Egypt were very different from what came before and what came after. Later in this series, we'll look at how Nasser and others responded to JFK's death. I would say that Nasser's deep sorrow over JFK's death, combined with what ultimately happens to Nasser, Egypt, and Palestine under President Johnson, these should all inform us if we're really closely paying attention. Suffice it to say that the Kennedy assassination and this transition to LBJ was catastrophic for Egypt. Not as bad as it was for Indonesia, but it was. I have an example here of the change in U.S. rhetoric, and this is from Time magazine, which is, of course, Henry Luce, CFR. This is the Empire, the mouthpiece of the Empire, but they're sort of friendly, quote-unquote, liberal PR entity posing as a news magazine. And there's an article from 1965, Egypt, the plot to kill Nasser. And the article states, of course, you've got the cover isn't even really about Egypt, but it has the sort of Orientalist, overtones that are pretty blatant, hitting you over the head. Here's the article, though, or apart from it. Led by Saeed Ramadan, an exiled and devout Egyptian editor, he kneels for his daily prayers. This is supposed to impress us about his devotion, I guess. The Brotherhood has been trying to overthrow Cairo governments since the early days of King Farouk. That's just not true. King Farouk actually used the Muslim Brotherhood as security for his coronation, I believe. But this is just ridiculous. Nasser tried to crush it out after one of its members fired 8 shots at him during a mass rally in Alexandria in 1954. But despite the execution of 6 of the brothers and the imprisonment of thousands of others, the organization survived. Establishing headquarters in Geneva, it was soon distributing an anti-Nasser magazine throughout the Arab world, smuggling arms to its underground organization in Egypt, raising money from such sources as the governments of Iran, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. There's more I'm going to read from this article, another short little paragraph, but it was Dreyfus, a guy named Robert Dreyfus, wrote a book on U.S. support for Islam, and he points out that there's a document from Swiss intelligence saying at the time that Saeed Ramadan was there, that he was known to be a U.S. intelligence asset, and the Saudis were also bankrolling him as well. So he was really given money from the imperial U.S. British big oil orbit as the most visible member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and was a CIA asset. So the way that Time is writing about this, they're mischaracterizing the Muslim Brotherhood as a nationalist force when it was really created by the British Empire and then was later backed by the CIA, including during these assassination attempts on Nasser.
Well, and of course, in the wars in Syria and Libya, the U.S. and its allies will end up supporting the Muslim Brotherhood again. In the case of Syria, one of the main so-called moderate rebel groups, Ahrar al-Sham, which was basically a Muslim Brotherhood front in Syria, and also going back previously under Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, there was an attempt at another coup, a violent uprising led by the Muslim Brotherhood that was supported by the U.S. and also at that time by Turkey. So this is a story that comes back again and again. The Muslim Brotherhood played a role as well in supporting the war in Libya as some of the forces on the ground backed by NATO.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty much a straight line from, and when you look in radical Islam, from the Muslim Brotherhood backed by the British Empire, then the Muslim Brotherhood migrates over to the U.S. imperial camp when the U.S. takes over, global hegemony, and then Muslim Brotherhood figures are eventually give rise to what becomes the Mujahideen, that becomes Al Qaeda, and then certain elements of that end up being part of ISIS. And pretty much in whatever they do, all their murder and mayhem, they always, when you look at it, it's never very difficult to see that they are advancing, like the original Muslim Brotherhood, that they're advancing the goals of Western imperialism. So this is really fascinating. But getting back to this 1965 article here, the second part of it, Hussein Taufik, a veteran terrorist who had successfully rubbed out one of King Farouk's finance ministers, was put in command of a select group assigned to blow up Nasser and his motorcade. If he failed, other brothers were ready to blast Nasser off his presidential train somewhere between Cairo and Alexandria, and still others were prepared to shoot him on the way to his home in the suburbs of Cairo. Not until mid-July did they catch up with Taufik's assassination teams. Not until Egyptian Air Force rebels were 10 minutes flying time from Nasser's summer residence at Alexandria was their loaded bomber shot down. So the way that Time is trying to depict Nasser here in 1965 is as a guy who is like being stalked by his own countrymen, a guy who is, I mean, the implication is that he's deemed as not a good Muslim by the people in the Muslim world. But he was the person who really had the heart of the Muslim world. I mean, when he died, it was an outpouring of grief like the country is, like the region has never seen. He's really the statesman of the Middle East during this whole era, really since the end of World War II, and since then you've mostly had client states of the West. So Nasser was really where the heart of the Middle East was, not these fundamentalist Islamists. The only reason that the Islamists and other related forces prevail is because of U.S. backing. So this is, I think, this is another reason why it's really despicable when people like Sam Harris and other, and Christopher Hitchens, who talk about how they're these rational atheists all the time, like, and they downplay U.S. imperialism. Like, this is what makes it even worse, is that, like, it's not even that they're like, bigoted towards religious people. It's that they're really, it's like they're attacking a straw man in a way, in that, or a fabrication, in that this is the product of social engineering from, imperialist forces outside of the Muslim world that get connected to this big oil economy and all this money throwing around, and it really has warped the culture and so on. So here they're talking about these assassinations, but it's really like the CIA's pitchman, Henry Luce, and his magazine is just like putting out a cover story really about what they're really talking about are U.S. covert operations, but they're framing it as though it's the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, well, and it shows that the so-called new atheists are just tools of empire. I mean, Richard Dawkins himself grew up in British colonial Africa and had like African servants. But I mean, even the younger generation, Sam Harris, is a complete neocon. I remember in 2016, during the presidential election, he supported Hillary Clinton. And I remember he did an interview in which he said that he likes Clinton because she knows where to fly her drones. And I remember in the interview, I wrote about it back in Alternate at the time. In the interview, he called for more weapons and support for the proxy war in Syria to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, a secular nationalist leader, on behalf of hardline, far-right Salafi jihadist militants who are basically, just Islamist fascists. And yet Sam Harris calls, Islam supposedly like a terrorist religion or whatever, where he's supporting objectively the most reactionary, fundamentalist, extremist elements of Islam against a secular government led by a Muslim, but a Muslim who believes in separation of religion and the state. So it just shows that all of those so-called new atheists, they're just handmaidens for empire. They're too stupid to see how they're used by empire. I mean, I'm not religious. I'm not a fan of religion, but like, it's so obvious what role they play politically is. But anyway, I mean, that's a whole other topic. Getting back to JFK, I think what this history is so important because one, it gives lie to this argument made by critics. I mean, I shouldn't say critics of JFK because there are things to criticize about JFK, right? But people who say that JFK was just the same as every other president, right? That the assassination of JFK is not important. This argument that we've unfortunately heard from people like Chomsky and others, right? That JFK was just yet another imperialist warmonger president. He didn't in any way challenge the bipartisan foreign policy orthodoxy in Washington. I mean, what these two cases of Egypt and Indonesia show is that JFK actually did support elements of third world nationalism, elements of these leaders who had been part of the non-aligned movement, like Sukarno and Nasser. So given that history, I mean, how do you think that we should today see the legacy of JFK and what should people learn from this history?
Well, his legacy towards leaders in the third world, like Sukarno, like Nasser, I think is something that we need to be aware of. We need to look at this because it tells you something about the U.S. regime and the U.S. empire. In the end, JFK attempted rapprochement with these two leaders, but they had already been, I mean, these are guys who had been attempted. Under Eisenhower, the U.S. attempted to kill these guys. I mean, they were as bad as you could be from the perspective of the U.S. Deep state, but Kennedy tried to work with him. We talked a lot about Sukarno last time, so I'm not going to really say a whole lot about him now. But with Nasser in Egypt and his drive for pan-Arabism, that he aggrieved a number of powerful adversaries: Rockefeller, Standard Oil interests, the British, Israel, Saudi Arabia. So the issue with Sukarno, with the issue with Nasser, just like with Sukarno and really with JFK, the main issue is the wealth and power of his enemies, and they were the wealthiest, most powerful people in the world. When it came to Yemen and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, Kennedy succumbed to pressure that probably no U.S. president could withstand if they wanted to stay in power. I think this is key to understanding JFK and the problems that we do see with his administration. We have the historically unprecedented wealth and power that the U.S. acquired by the end of World War II. We have the Cold War, which, as we have laid out, was a contrived conflict formulated and implemented to essentially sanctify all U.S. foreign policy that sought to establish geopolitical primacy and the protection of Western, especially American, capital. JFK was the only president to try to work with Nasser. Eisenhower and Dulles hated Nasser and Arab nationalism. They backed, reactionary Islamists like Saeed Ramadan of Muslim Brotherhood, or at worst, secular nationalists if they were anti-Nasser, which they did back characters like that in Syria and Iraq. As ever, there's the question of how to judge JFK in the context that he was actually operating in. Was he too compromising or not compromising enough? So it's easy enough for a Western U.S. leftist person to look at policy under JFK and say, well, he was no Che Guevara, no Eugene Debs. As a member of the bourgeoisie, Kennedy was first and foremost committed to reproducing capital accumulation in perpetuity. It is known, this is the way, whatever. But as we'll see when we talk about the assassination with Kwame Nkrumah, Castro, Sukarno, Nasser, and Bosch, none of these men had that response to Kennedy's assassination. Which it's funny because it's the same sort of leftist characters who will diss Kennedy, but will also talk about Orientalism and centering, global South voices. But then essentially they will turn around and assert that they really understand the U.S. empire and capitalism better than Castro, who survived dozens of CIA assassination plots, or Sukarno, who convened the Bandung Conference, or Kwame Nkrumah, who literally wrote the book Neocolonialism. This is the strain of doctrinaire leftists that says, essentially to people like Castro, Nasser, Sukarno, Kwame Nkrumah, okay, boomer, whatever, come back when you are the champion of dialectical materialism like me. So I don't think that this is a good, people are going to think what they're going to think. And ultimately, it's a really top-down system we live under. People's personal opinions, unfortunately, don't necessarily matter a whole lot. But I don't think this is a good way of looking at the way that this empire has evolved. And it figures like Kennedy or Henry Wallace or people who saw that a different path was necessary, because on top of the moral issues or whatever, we see that an empire is not sustainable in the long run. The U.S. is, I think, going to be entering a period of real turmoil. And I think it's going to become clear, if we survive this, that these were not actually in the national interests of the United States to try to set up this kind of an empire, like a win-win, as Kennedy was suggesting and Henry Wallace was suggesting. This would have been the way to go. It's worth noting that after Dallas, de Gaulle and Robert Kennedy thought the same thing as Castro, because all these leaders were targets of the same U.S. deep state that eliminated a JFK and Lumumba and Hammarskjöld. So anyway, all these third world statesmen believed Kennedy was someone they could work with, even as Kennedy was working to manage his own domestic political situation while also running the U.S. empire. So I would say that any honest look at the assassination, which we're going to cover later, shows that the U.S. establishment arrived at basically the same conclusions as Nasser and Sukarno. JFK was willing to work with foreign governments whose national priorities ran counter to the imperatives of the oligarchic forces that drive U.S. imperialism. So in response, the U.S. oligarchy or deep state killed JFK. However much anyone wants to say that Kennedy was either a loyal part of the U.S. aristocracy of corporate wealth or that he made too many compromises with power, the fact remains he was deemed insufficiently subservient to the dictates of the U.S. oligarchy, and he was killed for it. I don't think that if you look at the evidence in the assassination that there's any other conclusion you can arrive at. So I think you've got to judge him that way. If you think he made too many compromises, he still got killed. So that's something you got to take into account.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right there. And if we think of Kennedy as sort of, even if he's to the right of FDR, they're both market liberals, and there's a certain amount of, pushing a liberal international order that maybe is a little friendlier than the one that is, sort of presided over by Johnson after him, by Eisenhower before him. Like, there is a certain amount of continuity, of course. Like, there's echoes. The U.S. backing the Saudis in a Yemeni conflict is one kind of piece of nothing new under the sun that is just, and like you said, his options are limited. But at the same time, the worldview that his administration took on can be represented if you read, people like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who's kind of been I'd say the hagiographer of the JFK administration. So I'm not saying that that's necessarily, we're not, buying the Schlesinger line, but it's the same that they were putting out in documents. There's one in 62 where they're saying that, like, developing nations evolve in a way, and we're going to help them do it, that affords a congenial world environment for international cooperation and the growth of free institutions. And what that looks like in practice is, as you're saying, like, all these third world leaders have an understanding there's a lot more room to maneuver in that world. but I think he maybe came a little too early. If we'll talk a little bit in the Nixon administration about the Prussians versus the traders, the sort of warlords, exploitative, extractionary capital, and then you have your international sort of Wall Street. Any money moving is good, and you don't really need to worry whether or not somebody has national sovereignty, because in the end, that's not really where our power comes from. The power is going to come from the market. And the Schlesinger line and the JFK line, I would say, is that we just need more of that friendlier market liberalism. And again, that's to people in the third world, like that looked a whole lot better than being genocided by the Lyndon Johnson administration, and having U.S. troops march through Vietnam and every other country. Like there's a marked difference, and the real issue is that JFK came 20 years too early for the Trilateral Commission. If in the Prussians versus traders split, the traders weren't ready yet. They didn't have the institutional power in place to sort of absorb market freedoms for their own gain or national sovereignty for their own gain. And so they were perfectly okay in the 70s and 80s to sort of allow some of the things, some of the rhetoric that JFK is throwing out there doesn't sound that, some of it is still radical for today, and some of it is acceptable to a wide swath of the American political spectrum today, because we don't really care what exactly you do domestically, as long as you're not, taking over government ownership of oil fields, unless you're Saudi Arabia. And so it's, it's a matter of when the institutional power sort of could be configured in a way that they could absorb these shifts in the global environment. And they just weren't ready yet. And any barrier to the old-fashioned, they were fashioning an empire after the British still. And any barrier to old-fashioned extractionary capital that had direct ownership and relied on a much more, I would say, medieval form of sort of early capitalism, any barrier to that looked existential. It looked like communism. It looked like the mortal enemy of what they understood to be their economic system. Obviously, it proved a lot more amorphous than that, but they weren't quite ready to make that shift yet. And so I guess my point being, and I hope that doesn't make me an ultra leftist, is that it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be that JFK is Eugene Debs. It's just that backing this market liberalism 20 years too early, even that looks like an existential crisis and looks like he's gone over to the enemy. And the same with that, to them, Kissinger looked like a communist 20 years later. So they can see a whole lot of enemies where there are none, just because somebody didn't quite do enough for them, like you're saying, not quite subservient enough. So
just go ahead. I agree with you. And the point I would also add, I think we need to keep in mind, is that we have to consider Kennedy within the context of the 1960s. For me, it's not a coincidence that the year he becomes president, 61, is the same year that the non-aligned movement is officially formed in Yugoslavia. And we've talked about that because this is a new development, right? This is still pretty early on in the first Cold War. And at that moment, the non-aligned movement was a new attempt by the increasingly independent, newly free countries in the global south, the third world it was called at the time, who are finally achieving independence from colonialism. And many of them are saying, we don't want to pick a side in this Cold War. We want to be non-aligned. We want to have relations with the Soviet Union and China, and also with the West, right? And Kennedy represented the first and last and only U.S. president who tolerated that. And he was killed. From after his death, after his assassination in 1963, the U.S. said that if a country was non-aligned, they were effectively allied with the Soviet Union and or China, right? The Sino-Soviet split makes it a little more complicated. But the point is that after his death, you have the coup against Sukarno, you have the coup against Nkrumah. Eventually, Nasser, his term ends. He leaves power. So, I mean, the point is that, Tito does manage to hold on, but almost all of the other leaders of the non-aligned movement are removed through coups, or they're not really allowed to govern. And the U.S. destroys the non-aligned movement and basically forces countries to pick one of those sides. So the fact that Kennedy even allowed that to happen in the first place shows why he was eliminated because that was too much for the ruling class. That was too much for, you know, the deep state, these elements in organized crime, in capital. It was too much for capital. It was too much for the capitalist class in the United States, which said that if you are not actively anti-communist, you are effectively an ally of the Soviet Union and you need to be removed. And that was what all of these third world nationalist movements represented. They were not communists, but many of them were socialists. They were on the left and they were nationalists. And Kennedy was able to, he argued, not because he was an anti-imperialist, but he argued that the US could ally with those elements of third world nationalism and even tolerate some elements of socialism and win some of them over, as opposed to pushing them all into the communist camp. And,
right.
And after he was removed, the US position was, they're all the communist camp. We must destroy them all.
And he shared kind of the idea of FDR, and Nixon, I think, at least in rhetoric, sort of played the same game of may the best man win. You know, the kitchen debates with Khrushchev. There's a sense of let's just go big and see who does it better. And to some extent, that's better than global war and just genociding anybody. You're either with us or against us. And the same logic that we're covering with Sukarno, where we looked at him as in the Soviet camp because he's not sufficiently with Washington. He's not wiping out the PKI. The same logic applies domestically. And anybody who's not doing the same thing, like Kennedy, is not open or is way too open to the non-aligned movement. It's not that to them that makes him an ally of communism, because ceding any ground is too much. Because, and part of that is that it sets a precedent that maybe you get the option, if you don't fully go with the Soviets, to still do land reform. And that still becomes, again, an existential threat, at least it appears to be, to these interests that in the end are going to start to be, they're not going to hold on to power in the same way that they are now within 2 decades. But they can't see that the sort of the tides are moving against them toward a more internationalist capital that JFK represents. But they just can't see that is what's going to happen anyway, whether or not it's led by Kennedy and his brother or by just, you know, the movement of time and the Carter administration and late Nixon even.
Well, I would go back and qualify the relationship between those two big factions of the U.S. empire. The Prussian militarist neoconservative will become the neoconservative camps versus the international capital people, the traders, people like David Rockefeller. You could call them the neoliberals. Okay. And I would say that it wasn't so much that Kennedy was too early. It's that he was not really he was not a corporate liberal like Nelson Rockefeller was. Nelson Rockefeller represented that part of transnational capital that was less on the militarist side of everything compared to the more hawkish people. They're really interested in profits for corporate America. But if you look at the Trilateral Commission documents, they say explicitly our enemy is nationalism. Like they realize that this new financial system is being birthed, and that the trilateral part of East Asia, you know, Japan, especially Japan, Western Europe, and US, those are the 3 components of the trilateral system, and that they represent basically the West and capitalism, and that they were going to coordinate more between themselves now that Bretton Woods was ended in order to preserve the stability of the system. And this is, you know, this comes from the Rockefeller worldview of like corporate liberalism. So they're not right-wingers, outright fascists, but they ultimately believe in the sovereignty of capital, and that the U.S. can be the instrument of that, and that capital's rights are to be respected above all. So the Trilateral Commission was like, you know, nationalism is the enemy. They said that outright. That was not Kennedy's position. Kennedy actually believed in cooperative nationalism, sort of like Henry Wallace. So the Trilateral Commission is like capital uber alles, and we're going to coordinate that. And that's the corporate liberal side. And if you look at the Eisenhower administration and their whole CIA sprawling covert apparatus, because that's really the heyday of covert operations, and that Kennedy inherits, and he's like, it freaks him out to be in a number of ways, as we've seen and we're going to see more of. But it was Nelson Rockefeller who was the head and the guy who ran this like foreign policy intelligence advisory board that really oversaw covert operations. And that was Rockefeller. So that was the corporate part of the establishment. And Kennedy had a lot of those guys in his administration because they represented the more or less quote unquote liberal side of the establishment, but he had very different views from them. I mean, there are arguments that he has, like letters that he exchanges, and I think they get printed in Fortune magazine, between him and David Rockefeller, JFK and David Rockefeller, arguing over the role of the government in the economy. You have Nelson Rockefeller campaigning against Kennedy, saying like, you know, everywhere we're losing to the communists and so on, and this is just unacceptable. Nelson and Rockefeller interests in Brazil and Indonesia, oil interests in Saudi Arabia, they are messing up Kennedy's plans. I mean, to the point that when Robert Kennedy runs, he actually explicitly calls out the Standard Oil in Peru and says, just nationalize your oil. And then they said, but Standard Oil will be angry. The Rockefellers will be angry. David Rockefeller just came here and told us not to. And Kennedy says, we Kennedys eat Rockefellers for breakfast, which is, of course, bravado. But it's like Kennedy represented something, a third force in U.S. politics that was a vestige of the New Deal and the progressive democracy that existed in the U.S. And ultimately, Kennedy represented a democratic idea, a generally democratic way of being in the world that would be closer to international law. And he saw the Cold War was making it impossible to have the economic or foreign policies that he wanted. And this is why, as we'll get into later, future episode, that he moves to end the Cold War. He represented this third sort of progressive nationalist force that believed in international cooperation and basically what we see now, which win-win foreign policy, but from China. Like this is where, yes, Kennedy was ahead of his time, but it was by even more than that. And I don't know that the U.S. would have tolerated something like that from anyone. I think that they didn't tolerate it from Kennedy. And so he gets assassinated, even though he's got the highest average approval rating of any president in U.S. history since they recorded it. I mean, that's not a coincidence that he was the most popular, because I think for a time, under constraints, he attempted to manage the economy and the political system in the interests of the American public, and also with some concern for nationalist leaders in foreign countries. He was popular around the world. He was the most popular president around the world, and he had the highest approval rating in the United States. He used the awesome power of the U.S. at the time, the industrial economic power of the United States, and tweaked it a little bit towards improving living standards in the U.S. and managing the economy. Instead of allowing gains to be eaten up by inflation, like U.S. Steel tried to do, he cracks down on profiteering in the steel sector, confronts corporate America. He just he represented something different. And I think he actually believed in democracy, and that democracy could prevail in some ways, and that he could be the instrument of this. And this is perhaps why Alan Dulles says what he says about him. That little Kennedy, he thought he was a god, right? This is what Kennedy was attempting to do, I believe, but within the constraints of the Cold War, which was a national insanity. The entire thing had warped all foreign policy questions, but in ways that were very useful. It was the most useful, contrived, twilight struggle that the Soviets weren't in the mood for after losing 27 million. They were not to take over the whole world. This was just the perfect pretext for Western imperialism to be taken to the next level, which is to be managed by this global imperial hegemon that sits safe from any invasion, in the Western Hemisphere, the United States. And they ran with it. And this is what Kennedy was facing.
Yeah. And for me, I think this history of Kennedy's relation with third world nationalism is very important also, because today we're seeing something that is not dissimilar. And we're at a kind of transition moment where the US is escalating this new Cold War on both China and Russia. And in fact, this March, there was the so-called Summit for Democracy. And obviously it's a summit of US allies. And the US is trying to build a bloc of countries against China and Russia. But so much of the global South is maintaining this non-aligned position. And I think there are a lot of leaders today who would be very similar to Nasser and Sukarno and Nkrumah. So, for instance, in Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, I see him very much as a kind of Mossadegh figure. I mean, in March, he gave a massive rally in which he honored the anniversary of the nationalization of oil. He also boasted of nationalizing lithium. I mean, he is this kind of leftist nationalist figure. He's not a communist at all, but he's a left-wing nationalist. Similarly, in Brazil, right? Lula, he's not a communist, but he is a left-wing nationalist figure. He wants Brazil to be non-aligned. He's part of the BRICS, but like I mean, even in Indonesia, in fact, right now, there's a president, Jokowi, who is he's not a Sukarno figure. He's not like a left nationalist, but he is a nationalist. And he's talking about Indonesia having its own independent economic policy, using new local payment systems to get off the US dollar, the threat of US sanctions. He's doing trade with Russia. So the point is that Kennedy was like in this moment where he tolerated those kinds of leaders. He was willing to work with them, and he was removed. And now we see the US is pressuring all of these countries to obediently to join it, like telling them you can't be non-aligned. So if we had someone like Bernie Sanders, who is like, yeah, we're going to allow these leaders to be non-aligned, we can imagine what the response would have been.
We saw what it was with Bernie, who really wasn't very far to the left at all. I mean, they did everything to wipe him out. What's interesting now, the reason we see these leaders emerging now is because this is a change in this whole cycle of U.S. hegemony. And for many decades, the U.S. was so powerful that these forces were just crushed in these countries. But they still exist. People in countries and even leaders who, people in politics are corruptible, and part of that's why they go into politics in the first place. But we're seeing, as the U.S. power doesn't seem so unassailable now, and there's the opportunity to do business with China and with Russia to a lesser extent, but especially with China, we are seeing these forces emerge dialectically as the U.S. power wanes and as it loses prestige and so on. You have leaders like AMLO and the U.S. can't just go in and invade because it's such a bad look. I mean, how many times have we invaded Mexico already? We stole California and Arizona and Nevada from them, and I mean, we're in Texas even. I mean,
well, not only that. I mean, the Republicans complain about immigration now. Imagine if the U.S. and Republicans are the ones calling for invading Mexico, but imagine the migration crisis that would unleash.
I know, but then it would just be more grist for their mill of demagoguery, then they would just say these Mexicans are coming over here. We destroyed their country, and now they're coming here. Can you believe it? And they're using a drug excuse. They don't have the Cold War excuse anymore, and you have these weird events like Americans being attacked in Mexico, which to me, I really wonder if there's some sort of deep chicanery going on there, because it's such a perfect little mini pretext. And what AMLO is saying, he's made some really notable statements about the U.S. that you haven't heard coming from a Mexican head of state in my lifetime.
Definitely. I mean, this is a whole other can of worms, but I mean, the 4 U.S. citizens, they were not in, like on the beach in like touristy areas. They were in areas that people know they should not be in, where cartels have significant influence. The state is very weak. And some of them actually had a history of a drug record. I mean, obviously with the drug war and racism in the U.S., like oftentimes that's used against people. But I mean, like if someone who has a history of dealing cocaine is active in very shady areas in Mexico, and they get caught by the cartels, I think there are a lot of things, a lot of question marks raised there, asking what they were doing with the cartels. But of course, yeah, this is the perfect rationale used. But anyway, the point is that, like, I mean, AMLO, he's not Nicolas Maduro, he's not Hugo Chavez, right? But he's not a socialist. He doesn't talk about socialism. He doesn't openly criticize capitalism, but he is a left-wing nationalist. He's very left-wing. I mean, he does talk about poverty and inequality and helping the poor, but he also is a nationalist who believes in nationalizing Mexico's natural resources for its own benefit. And again, like, you don't need to be a socialist like Maduro or Chavez or Ortega to be targeted by the U.S. empire. And we're at a point now where the U.S. is telling these leaders like AMLO, you can't be neutral, and telling Lula, you cannot be neutral. You have to pick a side. And in the 1960s, with the emergence of the non-aligned movement, it was a very similar moment with Kennedy. Of course, Biden is not in any way a Kennedy. I mean, Biden is like an empty vessel. He's he's the embodiment of zombie imperialism and zombie neoliberalism, right? But like, imagine if there were a leader like that who could have tried to put a break on this new emerging Cold War and say, we don't want a new Cold War. We do believe in the idea of mutually beneficial win-win cooperation. It's just unimaginable to think of today.
Yeah, the difference is, I think, with Biden, and I mean, Biden is Reagan. There's really no difference. He's just an empty. I mean, his family seems more corrupt than
Reagan
Reagan's,
with even more dementia.
Yeah, but it's this. But what's interesting is that the U.S. is so limited. I mean, I'm really curious to see how the Peruvian situation plays out. And AMLO, I mean, not AMLO, but Lula, it's a similar situation where to Kennedy, where a lot of people want to people who are comfortable and not have no real worry of government repression or fascism coming and smiting them. They'll diss Lula, but it's like Lula found himself in jail. Like, did he compromise too much or not? Well, I don't know, but he found himself in jail, and so did Dilma for a while, right? They impeached Dilma. Didn't Dilma go to jail too? Or
Dilma was
impeached.
She was imprisoned under the Brazilian military dictatorship backed by the U.S. because she was a guerrilla. But yeah, she was impeached in 2016. They didn't imprison her, but it was obviously a bogus impeachment based on a budgetary action that she did that was completely normal that Bolsonaro did like every week. So it was a political coup.
Yeah.
And then the U.S. Justice Department was all involved in that.
Right. And that's why it's like, I don't pass judgment too much on these leaders like AMLO when they or like Lula when you can see that they are trying to reverse and act against these forces. And I mean, when somebody like him does get thrown in jail, then I think it just lends support to the idea of like, well, that really was. I mean, you got to sort of try to be sympathetic to think about what he was trying to manage. I mean, people like Allende, sure, I can say Allende maybe should have armed some people and tried to resist in a different way, but like ultimately the guy gets killed by them. You can't really judge people like that, especially if you're a person in the West who's like not middle class or something. I don't get this mentality. These are world historic forces that will kill people, millions of people. I mean, they can and have and will again if they need to. And this is a real serious historic. These are world historic processes, and the world history is pretty brutal when you look at it. We have illusions of democracy and how things work, but it's really a myth. Looked at it in the long way, the U.S. empire is as brutal as anything else, more so in terms of the scale of it. The other empires in history, like this is really something that we're living through with this shift, which I think is crumbling. And Kennedy was ahead of his time. It would have been in the national interest of the U.S. and it would have been in the world interest to do what Henry Wallace said, have a century of the common man where we actually allow win-win cooperation between countries. We don't try to dominate them economically or make them accept our property rights regime like the U.S. does, and then makes it a religious crusade. I mean, this is a big shift.
Yeah, and that's why, I mean, I think this series is important, and it's important to study this history. It's not ancient history. It's still very relevant today. And we can't understand the world that we're in if we don't understand people like JFK, why even they, despite all of their limitations, were seen as such threats.
And I think next week we'll get into Israel and JFK's Israel policies, which are themselves pretty fascinating. So I'm excited to do the next one.
Yeah, we'll also discuss Israel's nuclear weapons, which you're not allowed to mention. It cannot be publicly acknowledged that Israel has nuclear weapons. But our co-host Seamus had to run, but we will be back next time to discuss JFK's policy in the rest of West Asia, so-called Middle East. And this is the Empire and Deep State series. If you want to get early access to all of the episodes, you should go to patreon.com/American Exception. In general, you also should just listen to American Exception. It's one of my favorite podcasts. That's Aaron and Seamus host that. And then later on, we publish all of the videos as well. And yeah, Thanks, Aaron. I'm looking forward to continuing the series.
Thanks, Ben, and shout out to Seamus wherever he is out there doing the good work that he does. So it was great. Thanks. Thanks to Seamus McGuinness for producing the audio and video versions of this episode. Also, thanks to Mock Orange for providing the music. In the next installment, we're going to look at JFK's policies toward Israel. Mind the darkness.